That up. That's the first step to know it's working. Our presenter tonight is James Hollister, who has been a ranger at Minuteman National Historical Park for more than 20 years, serving as at different times as lead interpreter, education coordinator, and historic weapons supervisor. He also is very immersed in checking people's historic dress and uniform for all the events that they have. He has contributed to many publications for the National Park Service, and he is the principal organizer for the annual Patriots Day reenactments and tactical demonstrations. This year, there will be somewhere above 700, it sounds like, volunteers working together over that weekend to bring Battle Road alive for visitors. And we really hope that you are able to go and enjoy some of that. But if you're not, Minuteman is always there, just a little bit away. So tonight, Jim will be presenting a presentation on Massachusetts preparing for war. And if you want to take it away, Jim, start sharing
Great.
your
Yeah,
screen.
just thank you. Just give me one moment. What I'd like to do is actually just drop a link to our Patriots Day, our April events. Patriots Day, of course, is more than just one day for us. It's an entire month, and in reality, it kind of dominates all year. But yeah, we've got a great schedule of programs in the park throughout the month of April. The big one, of course, is on April 19th, the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Um, and so we've got a large-scale tactical demonstration happening in the park with 750 reenactors coming from all over the country, also from Canada and from the UK. A lot of people are really excited and putting in a lot of work to bring history to life. And some of the photos that I'll be sharing in my presentation tonight were taken at the event. So without further, I am just going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up my presentation. Um, Give me a moment here. All right, let's see. I think that's it. Okay. Can everybody see that?
No, we cannot.
Okay. Oh, of course you can. How about now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Excellent. Okay, so this presentation it's called obviously Massachusetts Prepares for War. So I will be kind of talking a little bit about what was going on in Massachusetts in the months leading up to April 19th, 1775. One of the things that we really focus on through our programming at the park um, is not just the grand narratives, but getting into the lived experience. What was it like to live through this time, which was actually quite frightening when people were seeing the fabric of their society being pulled apart. Um, and, politics were causing, polarization, neighbor against neighbor, um, and then just escalating and dramatic escalation as the government was sending over thousands of soldiers into Boston and really depriving people of their essential rights and liberties that they had enjoyed for generations. And they saw it all changing right before their eyes. And they were responding to it in ways that, may seem extreme, but really to them, this felt like an existential threat. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about an institution that is at the heart of a lot of these things, and that is the militia. Um, and I'm going to start with this quote from Reverend William Emerson, Concord's Patriot minister, during in the years before the war and during the war, up until 1776, when he actually died in service in the Continental Army. And so this was an excerpt of a sermon that he delivered on March 13th of 1775 during a muster of the Concord militia and Minuteman companies. And he wrote, and I always took this as a great example of the martial spirit of the militia, and how animated people were when the crisis was really upon them, in March of 1775. Of course, they didn't know the war was going to begin in just a little bit more than a month, but they knew that it really was tense and could happen at any time. So, military exercise, says a spirited writer, is not to be looked upon as a play fit for children, but as a work and business worthy men of genius and capacity. Men ought to engage in it, not as a diversion, but as an important career in which they may be qualified to stand in the high places of the field and speak with princes whenever the providence of God shall call upon them. However indifferently these ends may be regarded in general, yet I can scarcely persuade myself that there are any in this assembly who view the military character and qualifications with an indifferent eye in such a day as this, especially those who have already engaged in this important business and are to be considered under God as the guardians of our liberties and the protectors of our rights. And of course, he would go on during this sermon, he would say, "Arise, my injured countrymen, and plead even with the sword, the firelock, and the bayonet. Plead with your arms the birthright of Englishmen handed down to you by your never to be forgotten fathers. And if God does not help, it is because your sins testify against you." Really fire and brimstone stuff. Um, Highly political, which was very common to the ministers at the time. But when you look at this on its own, it looks like you have this incredibly animated, spirited militia ready to do what they have to do, which of course was taking on um, their own army. We talk about the British Army as if they're somebody else, but no, it was their army, their king. They were British subjects. But then you just delve a little deeper and you find something different. So again, this was March of 1775, but it's also interesting to note that less than 2 weeks earlier, the Concord town meeting warrant included an article to quote, "See what method the town will take to oblige those persons who have not attended their duty in the militia for past to comply with their duty in that respect and act on that affair as the town shall think proper." And the article was passed in the affirmative. So on the one hand, we have people who are on the brink of a crisis and are getting ready, but there are also still people being people. These are part-time soldiers, and a lot of them weren't even showing up. So that is part of the work that really encapsulates the work that lay ahead of a lot of these people in 1775. So I want to talk about the militia tradition. So the militia was a part-time citizen army, and it was actually one of the earliest institutions formed in the newly planted colony of Massachusetts Bay in the 1630s, and it was adapted from English traditions dating back centuries. Um, and of course, this is also the institution that fought against the French and the indigenous allies for generations. So they weren't professional soldiers, but they really had to do the job generation after generation. Um, they still exist today in the Massachusetts Army National Guard. If you talk to any guardsman and say when was the militia founded, they'll tell you 1637, and that was when the date of the first muster on Salem Common, and actually just prior to that, um, the colony's governing body, the Great and General Court, had established the first three permanent regiments: the East Regiment, North Regiment, and South Regiment. So really, today, at least ceremonially, the Massachusetts Army National Guard traces their roots back to this early militia tradition. So, who served? So, according to the 1693 Province Law, which was the law that was in effect in 1775, heavily updated, um, basically all men between the ages of 16 and 60 were required to be armed and to train. This body is often referred to as the train band. There were, of course, several exemptions. So, for example, members of the council, so meaning the government, the Great and General Court, the governor's council, representatives for the time being, the secretary, justices of the peace, president, fellows, students, and servants of Harvard College, masters of art, ministers, elders, and deacons of the churches, sheriffs, physicians, professed schoolmasters, anyone who had held commissions as officers in the militia before were exempted, as well as attorneys general, deputy sheriff, clerks, courts. I know this is quite tedious. There's a lot of them. One miller per town, masters of vessels more than 1 ton. Um, and also, at the very end, they put Indians and Negroes as exempted from serving in the militia. Now, you may think, great, you get out of it. But I suppose there's a fine line between exempted and prohibited. Training with arms was considered to be a sign of citizenship, of full investiture in the community, and its security. So there are some people who are exempted by privilege, and there are some people who are prohibited by race and status. So, however, there were clauses in the law that all of the exempt persons, including Indians and Negroes, if they were living in the community, were expected to keep arms, same as everybody else, and to have them inspected twice per year. So, if you were a black man of military age between 16 and 60, and you were enslaved in a household, your enslaver would have to provide arms for you, and that was in case of an alarm, meaning a military emergency. You expect to turn out. So they don't give you any training, but when things really get bad, you're expected to have a gun in your hand and do God knows what. Um, so now, in terms of the arms that they carried, there's a phrase that they used quite frequently that may sound very strange to modern ears: armed as according to law. Nowadays, we have, by the Second Amendment, we have the right to keep and bear arms. In the 18th century, of course, this wasn't so much a right as it was an obligation, just as much as we have certain obligations in our communities, in our country today. So everybody was expected to have a well-fixed firelock musket, meaning it's a flintlock ignition, a piece of flint and a piece of steel, which when they strike together, create sparks that ignite a charge of gunpowder. So that's what they mean by firelock. They said the barrel could not be less than 3.5 feet long, and that was because you'd be trained to fire these weapons in unison with other soldiers, um, usually standing in ranks, a front rank, a rear rank, and a center, front rank, a center rank, and a rear rank, and you'd be firing over somebody's shoulder. So if you had a weapon that was too short, you could injure whoever's in front of you. So they had to be usable military weapons, but privately owned. Um, they were also expected to have a bladed sidearm, like a cutting sword or a bayonet. Um, and if you couldn't provide yourself with either of those bladed weapons, um, you could avoid paying a fine by turning out with a hatchet or tomahawk. Um, And yeah, speaking of the fines, so if you were without any of these things, including also the ammunition, 12 bullet size to fit your gun, a pound of powder, so many flints. Um, so if you were deficient in any of this, you were to forfeit 2 shillings for every defect. Um, and same thing, 2 shillings for every 4 weeks that you remained unprovided. Um, and the fines would be paid by the parents for sons who are underage, um, and also by the heads of households and enslavers as well. So that was your responsibility to make sure that all the eligible men in the household had arms. Um, the towns, of course, also were not exempt from this. So towns were expected to keep a barrel of powder, which is about 100 pounds, and 200 weight of bullets and 300 flints for every 60 listed soldiers. They were also required to keep extra arms and ammunition to provide for those who were poor, temporarily poor, or what have you. So to make sure that everybody is provided. Now, training. I often hear at the park and visitors say, well, the militia didn't train. They were just militia. They were just farmers. Yes, they were. They were all those things. However, training was also, just like the equipment that you're carrying, training was also required by law. So the standard, it changes throughout the period. The standard was 2 days in April and 2 days in October. And then there would be 1 day each in May and June for instruction and inspection. So if you were the head of a household and you had men in your household who were not expected to train, that would be the time that you send their weapons out to be inspected, or you send them um, in your stead. So it really was very serious. And again, same thing with the arms that you kept. If you were deficient, you would be fined, and the fines would be paid to the company, and they would use the money to purchase things like colors, drums, and other things that the company would need. In some extreme cases, for extreme dereliction of duty, you could face jail time. The resolve in Concord that I had read to you was basically them getting back saying we need to enforce the law. Because it's important to remember for the militia, by the time we get to 1775, they had been going through generations of war. Of course, the 7 Years' War, well, over here it's known as the French and Indian War, had ended in 1763, and New France had fallen. It really felt like the threat of war was easing off. Peace was going to reign supreme. They were so proud to be part of the British Empire. They loved their new king, George III. Everything's great. So they started, like most people, they started to get kind of lax on their military obligations, which is why when we see them in the months before the revolution, there's a scramble to get them back into um, war readiness because they had gotten really lax. But in a perfect world, they are all attending their training. The clerk of the company keeps the record of the arms that are being kept, and everything's in good order. And they are a fully functioning military force, as they were during the French and Indian Wars. There's a wonderful quote by one of my favorite historians, Fred Anderson, who said by the middle of the 18th century, the militia was an all-purpose military infrastructure, part, um, you know, uh, part training cadre, um, supply depot, and rear echelon supply network. Um, so they really had this massive infrastructure, um, and it is in every single town and community. It was a very common duty among all military age men. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And I bring up the militia so early in this presentation because I'm just going to be making a lot of references to them. So it's important to understand who they were. But when we talk about the narrative of the American Revolutionary War, I usually go right to the period after the Boston Tea Party. Of course, as any fifth grader could tell you, there was the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties, 1765, 1767 for the Townsend duties. There were protests and boycotts, petitions, unrest in Boston. Somebody's mansion got pulled down. Oh well. Guess he had it coming to him, poor Hutchinson. But anyway, so there's a lot of unrest. But really, once you get to the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, that's when things escalate. Um, so, and the Boston Tea Party itself is a very interesting event. So obviously, it's in response to the Tea Act, which grants the East India Company essentially a monopoly to sell their tea in the colonies, and this was considered a win-win. Um, we get our tea at a discounted rate. The government gets to collect a 3 penny per pound tax, which people had been ignoring through the fine Yankee tradition of smuggling and bringing in Dutch tea, which didn't have a duty on it. So the government's trying to bail out the East India Company, so they offer them this deal, and they think this is going to be great for everybody, and the colonists will get cheaper tea, and we'll get our tax. Everybody's happy. Somehow people weren't happy, probably because the colonial merchants were being cut out. Um, so the Patriots had a very well-oiled propaganda machine. It was the Boston Committee of Correspondence, headed by Samuel Adams, and they started sending out circular letters in November urging other committees in Massachusetts towns to either form similar committees or to respond, share their thoughts on the destruction of the tea. Nobody knew what the fallout would be. A lot of towns responded right away saying, absolutely, we support this. We support our rights. This is a infraction of them, an imposition on our rights. But once the tea goes into the harbor, now nobody knows what's going to happen. There's going to be consequences. Um, and that the information on that starts to filter in um, as we get into the summer, the spring and then the summer of 1775. In May, General Thomas Gage replaces Thomas Hutchinson as the royal governor of Massachusetts Bay. And with him, word arrived of the Boston Port Act, which closes the port of Boston effective June 1st of 1774. And it would remain closed, no commerce going in or out until the destroyed tea, 342 chests of tea, would be paid for. Um, and they also brought word of the pending Massachusetts Government Act, which would take effect in the summer, um, later that summer, and it revoked the charter. It replaced the governor's council, which was sort of the upper chamber of the colonial legislature. So you had the House of Representatives, and then they would elect the governor's council. So there was a check on royal power. They controlled things like the governor's salary, um, representing the interests of the people. So when you think about the way government works, you've got top-down power, say from the king through the governor, um, and some of his chief officers, and then you've got bottom-up power, the people and their elected representatives. Now, in a perfect world, they meet in the middle, everybody's happy. Um, but this is going to cause a severe imbalance as the top-down power is now exerting more and more pressure, and people are really starting to feel it. Um, and in addition to that, thousands of soldiers began to flood into Boston all throughout that summer. And they would eventually number more than 4,000 soldiers encamped on Boston Common. And then later, as the weather got cold, they would be housed in empty houses and buildings and warehouses and things. And really just moving into the community. So had to get ready to meet the new neighbors, the soldiers and their families as well. Now, of course, despite these stunning developments, communities and opinions remain divided. In Marshfield, a little known episode, they passed a series of resolves over the winter, 1774, and they referred to the Tea Party as, quote, the late tumultuous and illegal proceedings in the town of Boston, and expressed that it was their indispensable duty, quote, to show our disapprobation of such measures and proceedings, end quote. And then they reaffirmed their loyalty to the king and his laws, and also their commitment to defend their liberties and privileges by all legal means against, quote, foreign or domestic enemies. So referring to their neighbors who had become, for all intents and purposes, radicalized. They also resolved that the activities in Boston were illegal and unjust and of a dangerous tendency. And they're reacting to violence against property, like the East India Company's tea, violence against people, customs officials, and other loyalists are being targeted and savagely beaten in Boston. So they're reacting to that. So it's not, the revolution is not all good versus evil. Both sides are engaging in some pretty nasty things. And of course, the Sons of Liberty, they were dangerous in many ways, even if you agreed with their cause. There was also during the summer a letter written by an anonymous writer who identified himself as a Philadelphian. And he was firmly on the Patriots' side, but he had an interesting take on it. He said, while we contend for liberty, Let us not destroy the idea of justice. A trespass has been committed on private property in consequence of the resolves of your town. Restore to the sufferers the most ample compensation for the injury they have suffered. Pay for the tea. It will rejoice your friends. It will convince your adversaries that the cause you are attached to is a righteous and a just cause. So he's saying, like, okay, our cause is just, but this is not the way to go about it. So just understand as we go through these things, it's not all one-sided. There are differences of opinions. Some people are afraid of their government. Some people are afraid of the Sons of Liberty or their neighbors. And it really depended on who you are, where you lived, and so forth. Now, there were other ways of fighting back. Now, one of the earliest ways that the colonists began to resist the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the presence of soldiers in Boston, to lift these sanctions and to restore their proper rights and liberties, um, there was economic resistance. So, Massachusetts Bay, as a royal province, was really dependent on Great Britain for trade. So, a lot of their essential household goods, fabrics, ceramics, and other manufacturers are coming over from England. So if you looked at somebody, from Massachusetts, they wouldn't look all that different from somebody who lived in London at the time. Maybe they're slightly behind the fashion, but really not a lot, because they're getting a lot of this straight from England. So a lot of their wool from England, Irish linens. Um, they also had access to fabrics from India, like India prints. Like this young boy here is actually wearing a gown. That's how young boys dressed before they were allowed to wear breeches, and that's of a printed India cotton. So they had access to a lot of these different fabrics, manufactured goods, and other even ironmongery, hardware, and things like that coming over from Great Britain. So they're going to boycott. Now, this was not a new idea. This had been tried in the 1760s. But now it is going to be a total economic boycott, not just enumerated items, but everything across the board. They will stop all commerce with Great Britain um, until the port is reopened. So it was called the Solemn League and Covenant, and it was circulated around, starting in Boston, the Committee of Correspondence, and then sent out to all the towns. It said, having taken into our serious consideration the present distressed condition of this insulted province, so they called for a boycott of all goods in order to prevent, quote, the horrors of slavery, the carnage and desolation of civil war. However, it came with some warnings. It said first, they would break off all trade with any merchant caught importing British goods. Second, if anyone refused to sign the covenant, they would, quote, publish their names to the world. Um, General Gage, the royal governor, referred to the Solemn League and Covenant as scandalous, traitorous, and seditious. Um, and he also threatened to apprehend and secure for trial anyone who conveyed or signed the covenant. So this left many people, again, with that sort of very uncomfortable choice. Am I more afraid of my neighbors, the Sons of Liberty, or my government? And then, of course, in September, this was replaced by the Continental Association, which was passed by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, again, continuing that boycott of British goods across all 13 colonies. The Solemn League and Covenant was only Massachusetts. And of course, it's women stepping up to make up the difference. They're encouraging more home manufacturing. So you're getting out the spinning wheel. So really, at this time and earlier, the spinning wheel becomes a symbol um, of resistance before people start picking up muskets. Now, there was also political resistance. Starting in the summer, you had county conventions. Part of the Massachusetts Government Act restricted town meetings. You could have one a year where you would elect your town officers and set your budget, and the royal governor had to approve the articles on the warrant. So they started holding county conventions, which nobody mentioned anything about, and they said, well, great, we'll just do this. And so they began adopting these. Now, the most well-known of the county conventions was the Suffolk County Convention, um, in September of 1774, and it referred to the late acts of the British Parliament as being gross infractions of those rights which are justly entitled, by the laws of nature, the British Constitution, and the Charter of this province. And no obedience is due from this province to the acts above mentioned, but that they be rejected as the attempts of a wicked administration to enslave America. And they even talked about the new judges. General Thomas Gage was able to appoint judges as a stipulation of the Massachusetts Government Act. So they're being separated from their system of justice, from their legislature. They're losing their voice. Um, and it said that the judges appointed under the new authority, quote, must be considered as under undue influence and are therefore unconstitutional officers, and as such, no regard ought to be paid to them by the people of this county. And then they also talked about the militia, and they said that the commissions of all the officers of the militia would be taken away and new elections to be held. Officers were elected by their companies. Um, and that was to ensure that the officer corps of the militia were politically reliable. So they're taking control. Now, were these things acted out? Yes, absolutely. Um, so you see a lot of local action happening. Um, so first of all, they talked about the judges being illegitimate. People started turning out by the hundreds, and in some cases, like in Worcester in early September, by the thousands. Some of them were militiamen standing in their ranks, even though they were unarmed, to close the courts, to prevent the crown appointed judges from even entering the courthouse. Um, and then they were forced to sign resignations. And in Worcester, this was, again, over 3,000 militiamen turn out. They forced the resignation of these judges and counselors who were then expected to read their resignations to the assembled throng, hat in hand, as a symbol of deference. And they were forced to walk between their assembled ranks, stopping periodically to read their resignation so that everyone could hear it. It was, they were not harmed, but it was a complete and total humiliation. This happened all throughout the fall, and basically by October, the royal courts all across the province of Massachusetts Bay were shut down. Um, so that is a big deal. They shut down the courts. Another thing that happened September 1st, General Thomas Gage, acting on intelligence that the towns were removing their allotted stocks of gunpowder from a common magazine in what's now Charlestown. It's now part of Somerville, leaving only the powder that was reserved for the royal government. Gage sent a party of soldiers out there to retrieve that powder, but word got out that the soldiers were out, that they had stolen gunpowder, and they also went further into the country and they seized two small artillery pieces. So the militia again turned out by the thousands, also spurred on by rumors that the British had begun firing upon the people in Boston, that the Navy in the harbor had begun to shell the town. They really thought the war was beginning. All of New England was in arms and in motion. In the Boston area, heading out in Worcester County, even out towards the Berkshires. They're coming up from Connecticut. There's a great account of women who were stuffing wallets, basically linen bags filled with food, handing them out to the militiamen as they were racing towards Cambridge and Charlestown. And so General Gage realized that within 24 hours, several thousand militiamen had assembled under arms, and he was very isolated. He has no courts. His counselors, the new Mandamus Council, which replaced the Governor's Council, mostly have been forced to resign. Um, the towns are assuming control of their militia. The militia are turning out against him. He has completely lost the countryside. Um, and they're also increasing militia training. They're doing this on their own. Instead of meeting 4 times a year as prescribed by law, many companies were training at least once a week and being warned to be ready to answer an alarm at a moment's notice. So that should start to sound familiar. And as usual, political action follows some of the local actions, the reality on the ground. So the Great and General Court, the representatives of the people, on September 1st, Governor Gage had issued a proclamation for the towns to elect representatives. And it was going to meet in Salem because he had moved the legislature temporarily to Salem. And however, late that month, on the 28th of September, he reversed his order, basically saying, nope, we're not going to call a general court, sending all of the representatives back to their towns. But by the 5th of October, those delegates, many of them showed up in Salem anyway. And as they assembled and they had a quorum, they waited on the governor to come and issue the oaths and basically swear them in and seat the Congress so that they can conduct business. And it was very clear after 24 hours of waiting that the governor was not going to come and begin the official proceedings. So on October 7th of 1774, the delegates drafted a set of resolves resolving themselves into a provincial congress. So they're saying we are going to meet anyway, despite the royal governor refusing to seat us. They are now meeting in open defiance of royal authority, and they adjourned to Concord and began assuming the reins of government in Massachusetts, including the first sequestering all the property taxes that were owed to the royal government. They said, hold on to those. And then, of course, later on, they appointed their own treasurer, who is then going to collect this money for the provincial Congress. So they have a cash flow coming in. They have representatives of the people. They are taxing. They're taking over the government. Um, and then they also, of course, look to military matters. They take control of the militia, continuing to commission officers who are newly elected by the towns, those politically reliable officers. And then with their money, they begin to prepare for war. So one of the first things they did is they established a committee to kind of, an exploratory committee. What are we going to need if this really reaches a boiling point? And the committee came back with a huge list, artillery of all different sizes, and all the equipment to either move those guns or serve those guns, to load and to fire them, to service them, and um, and also ammunition. The cannonballs of different sizes, including mortar rounds, exploding shells, gunpowder, thousands of pounds of gunpowder, musket balls, flints, small arms. They were allocating more than 20,000 pounds to procure arms and supplies. Now, that may not mean a lot to us. What is 20,000 pounds? It doesn't translate to modern money as easily as you may think. But to put it in perspective, you could buy a good dwelling house and maybe 20 acres of land for about 300 pounds. So 20,000 pounds is a huge sum of money. Um, so they are reasonably well funded. So they begin procuring these things, purchasing them from merchants who were importing arms for many, many years, and gunpowder, ammunition from other colonies. Great Britain placed an arms embargo on the colonies in September, but it was too late. A lot of this stuff is already here. Um, and of course, the provincial Congress is now gathering and stockpiling. They also began reorganizing the militia. Um, and establishing different regiments in different counties. And they also recommended that the towns form these special elite Minuteman companies. So, a brief explanation about Minutemen. Excuse me, I'm one thing ahead. So, when I say Minuteman, the simple answer is they were militiamen who were ready at a minute's notice. It's a little bit more complicated. They were recruited from among the militia. But unlike militia service, which was compulsory, serving in a Minuteman company was required by law. Excuse me, it was volunteer. So it was totally voluntary to serve in a Minuteman company, and it was a very strong declaration of your politics. And they trained instead of 4 days a year, they trained at least twice a week. And also, unlike the militia, they were paid for training by their towns, and on average, 1 shilling every time they turned out to drill, which was 2 half days a week. So about 4 or 5 hours at a time. So they were the elite of the militia, and the towns also made other provisions to make sure that they were fully equipped as according to law. Muskets, cartridge pouches for their ammunition, canteens, knapsacks, bayonets, the things that they were going to need to go to war. Now, we have this very interesting document from the town of Concord. This is when they were mustered into service. Concord finally organized their minute companies, two of them, each with about 50 men, in January of 75. And it said that, okay, we're following the advice of the provincial Congress. But listen to the language of this oath that they had to sign their names to. That we whose names are hereunto subscribed will defend His Majesty George III, his person, crown, and dignity. That we will at the same time, to the utmost of our power and ability, defend each and every of our charter rights, liberties, and privileges, and stand at a minute's warning with arms and ammunition thus to do. And that we will at all times and at all places obey our officers chosen by ourselves, and other superior officers in ordering and disciplining us. And that we will appear when and where said officers shall appoint for that purpose. So this was not an independence movement yet. This was to fight for their rights as Englishmen, and they are still asserting their loyalty to the king, but they will not be pushed around by Parliament. Now, also, not all Minutemen were white. Um, there were, now, of course, black men were prohibited from serving in the militia, except in an emergency. But as is usually the case in wartime, even during the French and Indian Wars, when enlistments are lagging, they would turn to the black population. In many cases, if a white enslaver was drafted for active duty in the militia, he could send his enslaved man in his stead, um, or other people could pay them to serve in their stead. So it was a very, very common practice, and that's going to get repeated during the Revolution. But what's interesting is that there are accounts of some enslaved black men actually joining Minuteman companies, obviously with the permission of their enslaver, but and it seems to be a de facto emancipation, like Peter Salem of Framingham and Jeffrey Hemingway of Framingham joined Captain Simon Edgell's company, a Minuteman company. Um, so they might have been still enslaved, they might have been free, we don't know. I would think that there would be a stigma for somebody to serve alongside of somebody else's literally property, but there doesn't seem to be. I think there's a community dynamic that is not documented where they know each other, um, and they're all there in a common cause. Um, but you have to wonder, why would these men serve to defend a community, a culture that considers them inferior? And of course, they have their own reasons. What does liberty mean to you? What did it mean to them? Probably very similar things, but much more acute if you're actually enslaved by another person. We know of at least 20, possibly up to 40 Patriots of color who fought at Lexington and Concord. And of course, many more at Bunker Hill. It's an interesting, in fact, that we get from historian John Hannigan, who's works at the Massachusetts State Archives. He did his dissertation on black soldiers of the Revolution from Massachusetts. By the war's end, 94% of military-age black men saw service in the militia or in the Continental Army. So very, very high. And for a lot of them, it was a path to emancipation, but not a short one. Some of them, like Cato Smith of Lincoln, served during the war, died in service. He died in January of 1777 after fighting all through Long Island and New York. And his former enslaver, William Smith of Lincoln, collected his back pay. So was he a free man when he died? He was certainly a soldier. Um, Yet there's obviously still a relationship there, as his enslaver felt entitled to his pay. Um, but even still, and also the Continental Army, once it formed, it was an integrated army. They didn't have them in their own separate regiment like you see during the Civil War. They were all integrated. It was the same thing with the militia, Lexington and Concord, and then during the siege of Boston. And another thing I should point out, getting back to the provincial Congress. So by February, they had determined that they were going to raise a Massachusetts army of 15,000 men. So when they begin stockpiling arms and ammunition in places like Concord and Salem and Worcester and Groton and Lancaster, Stoughton, which is today Sharon, um, those arms and supplies are for the Massachusetts Army. And this here was rules and regulations for the Massachusetts Army, and it was first published April 5th of 1775. So that is 2 weeks before the war began. This is high treason. There is not supposed to be a Massachusetts army, but that gives you a sense of just how well prepared they were. And of course, in this period of very high tension, something was bound to happen, and of course, it did. General Thomas Gage is isolated, and he's under pressure from his superiors in London to fix this, to bring Massachusetts under control. They're not listening to him. He'd been sending entreaties to Lord Dartmouth, the colonial secretary. He says, if you think 10,000 men is sufficient, send me 20,000. If you think £1,000,000 is sufficient, send two. You'll save blood and treasure in the end. They come back to him. They're like, look, this is a rabble you're facing. You know, you have 4,000 professional soldiers. You haven't even used them. And they basically ordered him to act. Um, they said, arrest the principal leaders, disarm them, show them you're serious. And so, without any other options, on the night of April 18th, General Gage dispatched 700 soldiers on a secret expedition 18 miles into the countryside to the town of Concord. Their orders were to so he said that he'd received intelligence that the quantity of ammunition, provision, artillery, tents, and small arms had been collected at Concord for the avowed purpose of raising and supporting a rebellion against His Majesty. You will march with the corps of grenadiers and light infantry put under your command with the utmost secrecy to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all military stores whatsoever. But you will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or harm private property. And he then provided specifics on how to dispose of these things, beating in the muzzles of brass artillery, knocking the mounting blocks off of iron guns, disposing of musket balls by throwing them out from their pockets in small groups. Um, but the colonists are ready for them because of all of these preparations that we've been discussing. Um, so the mission, of course, is very straightforward. They've got to march from Boston all the way out to Concord, way over here. The first clash of arms was in Lexington at dawn as they met the Lexington militia in arms. So the first shots of the war, the first casualties are in Lexington um, at dawn. So there were 8 militiamen killed and there were 10 wounded, and they could then continue their march towards through Lincoln towards Concord. So I can imagine if you were watching them pass by your house, you would have smelled the sulfur coming from their guns as they had already killed some of your countrymen. His word is now spreading through the countryside of the tragedy that had happened in Lexington. Mary Hartwell, who lived in Lincoln, her husband was a Minuteman. He had already gone off to Concord to wait for the British Army to arrive. She saw that army marching past her house down the Bay Road. She said the army of the king marched up in fine order. Their bayonets glistened in the sunlight like a field of waving grain. Had it not been for the purpose they came for, I should say it was the handsomest sight I ever saw. And also left out of the narrative are the hundreds of women and children and older men who had to flee their homes as men are preparing themselves with their arms and ammunition, provisions, marching off with their companies. The women were left to safeguard the children uh, and other family valuables. So they're hiding them in out of the way places. They're taking their children with them. They're fleeing. They're getting away from the road because you can imagine one of the first things Mary Hartwell did after that army marched past her house in fine order. She grabbed her 3 daughters and they got out. They left the home in a hurry. And of course, they don't know if they're going to have a home to come back to. And imagine, having to take charge of your children, in some cases, very numerous families, and dealing with these frightened children and trying to reassure them, basically making sure that there's something survives this day in case the worst happens. So we talked about Lexington. So here's an engraving that was done a few weeks after the battle by Connecticut militiaman Amos Doolittle, showing how the Battle of Lexington was viewed in the American camp during the war, in the early part of the war. Very much a massacre, very lopsided. There were no British casualties in Lexington, but on the colonial side, 8 dead, 10 wounded. The next fighting was in Concord at about 9:30 in the morning at Concord's North Bridge, where a detachment of soldiers were confronted by over 400 militiamen, who, after receiving fire from the British and taking casualties, two were killed at the bridge. They were first ordered to return fire on the king's soldiers, an act of treason and rebellion that was later immortalized by the writer Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1835 as the shot heard round the world. But from there on, of course, now the British, with a war having just started, have to go all the way back 18 miles back to Boston. And that's where a lot of the really heavy fighting takes place. It was a harrowing experience for the British soldiers. They'd marched nearly 30 miles, had very little or no sleep in over 30 hours, actually over 30 miles, almost 40 miles. They were frustrated by the incessant attacks from a mostly concealed enemy who was constantly bringing in fresh troops. As one officer, Lieutenant John Barker, wrote, their numbers were increasing from all parts while ours was reducing by death, wound, and fatigue. And we were totally surrounded by such an incessant fire as it is impossible to conceive. And here's a little mock up from our visitor center from a long time ago of the scope of what's called the Lexington Alarm. These are the 27 towns that responded to the Lexington Alarm in time to actually engage the British, and where they're coming from. And the red dot represents the line of march. You can see Menotomy. You've got troops coming in from Dedham, Needham, Newton, Watertown, other troops coming down from Essex County, Danvers, Beverly, Lynn, Malden, converging. That was a meat grinder. House to house fighting. It was absolutely brutal. Oops. But by the end of the day, 273 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, and 95 colonists were also likewise killed or wounded. But also the scope of it, there were over 4,000 militiamen who responded by the end of the day. Um, sorry, just getting back to that last graphic. Within 3 days, there were 20,000 that responded to the Lexington alarm and began to lay siege to the town. And I love this quote from General Thomas Gage, who had been telling them all along about these military preparations, telling his superiors in London, who weren't listening to them. So a letter he wrote to the one of the members of the House of Lords, Lord Barrington, April 22nd, 1775. He wrote to him, the whole country was assembled in arms with surprising expedition, and several thousand are now assembled about this town, threatening to attack and getting up artillery. And we are very busy in making preparations to oppose them. It's basically, that is one of the most politely written, I told you so um, letters in American history. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm sorry I went a bit long. Do we have time for a few questions?
We do. If anybody has any questions, you can start typing them in. One of my questions for you, Jim, is if you had never read a book about the Siege of Boston, about Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, what would you recommend?
So I think, all right, I'm going to
The
be
tough.
super basic here.
Yeah.
If you want to just wrap your mind around the day's events, I would actually recommend the hour by hour account of the Lexington Concord Battle Road done by the Boston Historic Sites Commission um, in the 1950s in preparation for creating Minuteman National Historical Park. So it's a good sort of just the basics. Some of the facts are a little, but they're actually pretty good. Um, if you want to get into more of what I was talking about, the arms race, I would recommend a book by historian John Bell called The Road to Concord: How Four Stolen Cannons Ignited the American Revolution. Um, if you want sort of the story of Paul Revere and the battle and some of the political intrigue surrounding it, all right, I'll just recommend it. David Hackett Fisher, Paul Revere's Ride.
Hmm.
Just be careful, be an informed consumer. If something seems weird, check his sources. Um, they don't always justify his conclusions, but he does at least provide them. Um,
Yes.
that is probably one of the most comprehensive, and it is a good book, and it's a wonderful read.
Hmm.
I mean, it did get a Pulitzer Prize, so I
Right. It's
can't
hard
mention
to
too much.
argue with the committee. We are getting a new book called The Ride, which is coming out, I think, next month, which is about Paul Revere's Ride. I
Oh,
have not
excellent.
read it yet, but it should be interesting.
I'll have to check that
Sheila
one out.
has a question. In the early days, were there any eligible men who were not allowed into the militia due to behavior, politics, or small town feuding?
Ooh, okay. I mean, there were always feuds within communities. One of the earliest feuds, actually, the governor got involved. This was in the 1650s, where a town had elected a captain and then decided, nope, we don't like him. I don't know what he did, but they decided, nope, we don't like him. So they voted him out and they sent another name to the royal governor. And the governor said, oh, no, 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 no. I commissioned this guy. You're stuck with him. And basically threatened to charge them with mutiny and insubordination. Um, I think in that case, the governor backed down. Um, so again, there's always disputes between neighbors. In this period, I mean, yeah, you do see people who are being brought up on charges for not attending drill for various reasons. And we have accounts of people on April 19th who didn't show up.
Mm.
Like Nathaniel Whittemore and Moses Reed, who lived in Lexington. They didn't show up. They should have been on the town green, but they weren't there. And that was because um, Nathan Barrett's daughter, Moses's wife, Sarah Whittemore Reed, had given birth recently, and she was very sick. And they were afraid that if she dies and then Moses gets himself killed, she'll be a widow. I mean, the daughter would be an orphan.
Mm.
And they weren't fined, they weren't punished. So there does seem to be some leeway. Um, but if you're a regular shirker of your responsibilities, but in terms of like the politics, absolutely. Oh, goodness, I have a great one. Jonas Minot of Concord. Here, what am I rambling about for? Jonas Minot of Concord um, was not a loyalist per se, but he was one of those people who's kind of like, what's going on? I don't know who to support. I don't like, I get these people saying one thing, I get these people saying another. What do I do? And he was a captain of a militia company, and the other captains in town and in his regiment were saying, you need to start training your men once a week. And he's like, but that's against the law to appear under arms more than, outside of regular trainings. And they like, you better do it and have them ready at a minute's notice. And he's like, that's treason. So he had some business to transact with General Brattle in Cambridge, who was a no loyalist, and he just happened to mention his dilemma. And Brattle told him, like, oh, no, no, you're right. Don't do it. And he said, but they're going to throw me out of town. I'm going to lose my home. And he said, better to lose your house and land than to be hanged as a rebel.
Mm.
The letter actually got picked up and published in the newspaper. It also tipped off, Brattle also tipped off Gage about the powder that was being removed, and that prompted Gage to go get the powder, and that sparked the powder alarm that I talked about. But poor Jonas Minot had to then write an apology. So just imagine like you drafted a really nasty email and it got away from you. And it goes to, or basically copied everybody on it. Um, hit reply all to a private email. Very embarrassing. He lost his commission when they were doing the new elections. He was voted out, though he wasn't forced to leave town, and he eventually did reconcile.
So he's like
Brattle
just
wasn't so lucky. He had to
put in the
leave.
corner for some quiet, thoughtful
Yeah,
time.
yeah. It's like you sit down and don't cause any more trouble. And when you're ready, you can have your commission back.
and maybe a cookie.
Yeah.
Um, does, are there any other questions that people have? If nobody has been to the reenactment and the events throughout the year, what is your favorite event to recommend to people to get the breadth and depth of the historical research and the experience and having a really like great time at the park?
Um, Halloween. No, we love Halloween.
They do. They love pumpkins at Minuteman.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, obviously come to Battle Road. Because that's where we just have so many knowledgeable interpreters, open houses. You can visit Hartwell Tavern and the Smith House that are witness houses on the Battle Road. They'll be staffed by living history volunteers who really know their stuff. They can really bring it to life for you. You get to see, of course, this pageant, the civilian evacuation, followed by this massive tactical demonstration. We're going to have over 300 British soldiers in the road. It's going to look amazing. But again, you get to actually talk with these people. We also run a nice little event on Columbus Day weekend in October called Preparing for Winter, Preparing for War. We've done it for a number of years. This one was a big one that we did this past October. And it's all about, you know, you've got the seasonal rhythms of like, okay, the agricultural rhythms of life. You've brought in the harvest. The food now has to be processed and preserved. Getting the house ready for the colder months, chopping the firewood and all of that. Beginning to slaughter the animals as the weather gets colder. But then you have this political dimension on top of everything in a very uncertain future. So we had different talks and vignettes, living history, kind of bringing out those stories of how people were responding to that. So we're going to do a version of that again this October, but we're going to bring it up to date into October of 1775. It's going to be all about life in the countryside during the siege,
Mhm.
where you have men who would normally be doing the harvest who are now sitting in trenches, um, in Cambridge and Roxbury and Somerville and such, um, and shortages and trying to supply the Army as well. So that's going to be a great event. We usually feature one of our favorite living history groups called the Ladies Association of Revolutionary America, who do a tremendous job. They're wonderful storytellers, they're wonderful historians, and they really help us bring the stories to life. So yeah, definitely come out. And that happens at Hartwell Tavern.
Nice. All right. We don't have any more questions.
Oh, there's one about
Um,
those who left their homes.
oh,
The only people who went to Boston were loyalists who now had to flee their homes because their neighbors were now their enemies. Most people, yeah, they went to stay with relatives. They were really just trying to get away from the road. If you lived along the main route from Boston to Concord, it was called the Bay Road. Parts of it are now Mass Ave and Route 2A and Lexington Road. If you lived near the road, you got out. So they usually went and stayed with friends, with neighbors, with relatives who lived much further away, on the outskirts of town.
all right.
Okay, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out. I hope that the snow does not hit us really tomorrow because my driveway is very steep and hard to shovel. So thanks to Ranger Jim for joining us, and I hope everybody has a great evening. And we'll see you around the library.
Thanks. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.